Are you guys familiar at all with the seed oil thing?
Just lightly. I'm not a scientist on it either. I'm cutting seed oils out just because.
Why not?
Yeah, why not?
not?
Like while
it's-
we're at it,
it's-
I'm going to assume it's
It's
correct.
toxic. If you look into how they're produced, it's, there's so many chemical derivatives just to get a seed to the seed oil end product. They're extracting it with chemicals like hexane, and then they're putting deodorizers in on it. And then it's a polyunsaturated fat, so it oxidizes greater naturally, and then it sits on the shelf in a clear plastic bottle, and the only reason it's not, obviously it's rancid is because they put all these deodorizers and coloring in it. So it's really a toxic end-to-end product. You could make a more natural seed oil if it was like cold press and all that, and debate what, health ramifications that has. But typically from just end to end, like a canola oil is just extremely toxic.
Is that the canola is the seed?
Yes, it comes from the rapeseed plant.
Interesting.
Those are those fields you see with the yellow bloom.
And then they're also, of course, a monocrop, getting back to, being sprayed with glyphosate and Roundup.
I read it. We planted sunflowers a couple years ago, and they're amazing. And it's crazy when you take the head, you bash it, and the seeds go flying out. And I was reading how indigenous natives, they would take all the seeds and they'd press it using like wood planks or something, and they get the oil out of it. And so I thought it was kind of strange when people said seed oils are bad. And I'm like, but people have been eating sunflower seed oils. So is it really the seed themselves, or as you're saying, is it the process and the toxification after the fact?
It's both, because then imagine what quantity are you actually going to be able to do that at if you did it like manually. Like it's not a very scalable process to like naturally extract and cold press. So the fact that we're consuming this quantity of seed oils and then the oxidized linoleic acid and everything is the real problem. It's comprising such a large portion of calories that our biology is not meant for that, and it's really a mitochondrial toxin at the end of the day.
So I've heard avocado oil, olive oil are really good. Are y'all familiar with Brian Johnson, the guy who wants to live forever?
Yes.
He said a teaspoon of olive oil with every meal is one of the most powerful anti-aging things you can do. Is there any concern about animal proteins? He's a vegan. That's why I bring it up.
I would prefer to always cook with like a saturated fat, because it's going to be the least prone to oxidation when you're cooking at high heat. So I personally cook with butter or beef tallow. But then if you have a good extra virgin olive oil, drizzle that on top or use it as finishing, or if you're cooking at low temperatures, I think that's great. But the problem with olive oil and avocado oil is like 80 to 90% of them on the shelves in the store are actually cut with seed oils. And this goes back to this whole like marketing and labeling problem that we have in our food system as well.
Have you, let me ask you guys a question. If you went to a restaurant and they had a it said meat steak entree with an asterisk next to it, would you would you eat something described as generic meat product, or like would you have questions about it?
I don't really know what you mean. Is there such
Like
a thing? Like it's not meat, or is it a process?
No, like you go to a restaurant and you're like, "Do you have steak? We have meat steak." Would you ask?
That would freak me out.
Yeah,
for sure.
What's meat
For sure.
what's meat steak and why are you calling it that?
Right,
Can't you tell me if it's beef or bison?
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I bison steak is, and I bring this up because my buddy Luke, I bring him up because he's a crazy health nut, right? He has a card, and it says, "Here are all the things I cannot eat," and he hands it to the waiter, and then basically forces them to disinfect and sterilize the kitchen. But he asked the question, what do you fry your foods in? And they say, I'll check. And do you know what they always say? Vegetable oil.
Yeah.
Right.
And to which my response was, which one?
Right.
They don't know.
Yeah.
And so I have concerns about what that literally means, because, I mean, there's some vegetables, like we've got poisonous vegetables outside. I assume the majority of vegetables you can't actually eat.
Well, I mean, and I think that the seed oils is being called a vegetable oil. So I mean,
it's the same stuff.
It's all
That is pure labeling for vegetable as a positive connotation. That's why they changed the name from like rapeseed oil to canola oil too. It's like, who's gonna buy rapeseed oil?
But this gets into a fundamental thing. What is the role of the USDA?
Yeah.
And the structure is that actually FDA has oversight in terms of food safety over USDA. So what is the role for USDA and FDA under MAHA to ensure that we have transparency in labeling? I think that's one of the key issues of MAHA, is that consumers have the right to know. And there's a lot of this, it is misinformation. They are basically inventing words or substituting language that's being allowed by our regulatory authorities in order to avoid true transparency to the consumer so that they have informed information they need to make an informed choice. And that, I think, as we talk about these fine issues about nanny state, et cetera, I think one thing that we should all be able to agree on is that we have truth in labeling. And there's so many ways that that's twisted. For instance, one of the ones that I love, you seem to be pretty aware of the agriculture industry and beef and chicken, et cetera. So did you know that increasingly our meat is coming from the rainforest? It's coming from Brazil, the biggest meat packer in the world that's kind of sweeping over and controlling all of our meat processing is Brazilian. And the rule is that they can import animal products, we could call it food, into the United States from offshore whatever source. And by the way, those sources have different rules in terms of pesticides, vaccines, all kinds of things. They can import it into the United States, and all they have to do is basically put a knife on that meat, and then it can be labeled as made in the United States. And you have no visibility in terms of what the chain is that brought that food to your table. The only thing that you can do in the face of all this is try to seek out local farmers and buy, here in Virginia, we love to buy local Virginia grass-fed beef, and where you're buying it from the farmer, and typically it's a smaller farmer. This is kind of the whole Joel Salatin issue. Is getting away from these huge factory farms that's producing major amounts of pork, chicken, and imported beef, and back to more of a local, bottom-up, decentralized food supply for our meats, because basically the industry has figured out all these different ways to kind of cook the books.
I think you have to get back to, I think what Bob is going to have to do is get back to actually, as taxpayers, we're going to have to decide that we want to fund unbiased studies being done by our own science body that's hopefully selected by people like Robert Kennedy Jr. What I didn't realize before I started investigating, the pharmaceutical industry, is that the industries are doing all the safety trials. They're doing their own studies. They're cherry picking their own study. So they're not even, one of the things Robert Kennedy Jr. is going to do right away is he's saying, when he says radical transparency, he's going to make every industry show every study they did, not just the ones that gave them the result they wanted, so that we can say, wait a minute, because all we're seeing when you're at the FDA, if you're going to a VRBAC committee, which is the committee that decides whether a drug gets onto the market, or you go to the CDC's ACIP committees, all you're seeing from the industry is the study that proved what they wanted to prove. This product actually pulled this off. You don't see the 5 that failed, the 5 trials that failed. If we saw all of the trials that were going on, I think we might have a different perspective.
Just to clarify, you're saying a company will do a study, fail, do another study, fail,
hide it,
do another study, do another study, and say, we got it.
It's worse than that. It's worse than that, Tim. Yeah. So, as somebody who's an expert in regulatory affairs, what the general rules are in pharma is you don't ever do any study that the FDA doesn't require you to do, because you might get a bad outcome and screw up your product, okay? So that's one of the reasons why they don't investigate these things that we're all perplexed about. How come you didn't look into this? Yeah. Now, another thing that what Dell's pointing to, this kind of suppression of information or failure to reveal key information, that is technically not allowed in terms of the FDA, and that's a case of not enforcing the regs that are on the books. So the rules are that if you're Corporation X and you're developing product Y, and some academic somewhere does a study that relates to product Y, you're supposed to put that in your regulatory package and disclose it to the FDA. They're supposed to, you talk about radical transparency. Yep. The rules are that there's supposed to be radical transparency, and they're not being enforced. And that is, I think, one of the big things, and that's where you get to the corruption of the FDA because of these revolving door relationships, et cetera, is we've created a kind of a government culture where it's okay to only enforce the rules that you want to enforce, and only enforce them for those companies that you aren't with you. So for big pharma, they get to slide on all kinds of stuff, whereas small biotech innovators have the rule book thrown at them. And that whole dynamic has got to change. It gets back to, government creating monopolies. And one of the ways they do it is they give special allowance to the big boys that allows them to engage in these practices.
Or on top of that, the big boys have the legal means to challenge government resources in court and win, whereas smaller producers don't have that same ability.
True.
Even more, the most surprising thing to me in working with Bobby and starting to really, I was looking at the list of jobs he had to fill. He's going to have 80,000 employees underneath him. He got to add 300 of his own, and just looking at how this whole thing works. But what I didn't realize is that, the big industries will act like, oh my God, all the regulations have got our hands tied. It's terrible dealing with the FDA. They're the ones that set the regulations.
Yes, absolutely.
They're the ones that demanded it. They
precisely.
prefer it.
This is another key thing, is that regulations are the friend of the big boys, the big players, because they're the only ones that have the capital and the infrastructure in order to meet those regulatory requirements. And so the regulations serve to exclude the smaller or to mid-size innovator, which is what the big boys, whether it's big ag or big pharma or, fill in the blank, they like to have that complex regulatory environment because it gives them a competitive advantage, because their small innovator competitors can't comply with the federal requirements.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon, so subscribe and come hang out.